Hello, and welcome back to COM 252. Chapter 2 is about how culture impacts our interpersonal communication behaviors. Diversity is a big buzzword in the modern workplace, and we can see from recent news that embracing diversity and managing implicit bias is still a huge challenge for many organizations. We should care about cultural differences for many reasons, including some of the demographic changes that the United States is undergoing right now, the view that we should be more sensitive to cultural differences, which is really a movement from an assimilationist attitude to more of embracing diversity. We learn from Chapter 1 that studying communication can lead to greater professional success. Research shows that greater cultural sensitivity often results in having more employment opportunities and also helps us make more money. Advances in communication technology are another reason why we should embrace culture a bit more. Because we have the economic and political interdependence that technology offers us, being savvy of cultural differences as we're communicating through different channels is critical. In this chapter, we learn more about the culture-specific nature of interpersonal communication. But first, let's talk about culture, specifically what it is and what it isn't. Culture is defined as the relatively specialized lifestyle of a group of people that is passed on from one generation to the next through communication. So, this means that culture is passed on from generation to generation. But it is not synonymous with things like race or nationality. It also doesn't refer to things like skin color or eye shape. What culture does include is values, beliefs, attitudes, language, behaviors, art, laws, religion, and our communication theories, styles, and our attitude about communication. One thing that your text does mention is an idea of cultural evolution, which is also known as social Darwinism. This view poses that some cultures are more primitive than others. This view is often rejected because judgments that distinguish one culture from another have no scientific basis. This view is often based on our individual views, values, and preferences. What's more modern is cultural relativism. This idea means that all cultures are different, but no culture is really superior or inferior to that of any other. Another concept that is important to consider is how our language shapes how we view the world. This idea is called linguistic relativism. And this is the notion that the worldview of a culture is shaped and reflected by the language its members speak. One hypothesis that's largely driven this idea is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir and Whorf were two scientists who decided to study Hopi American Indians. They found some very interesting things while immersed in their culture, specifically that there's no discernment between nouns and verbs. So take a minute to think about how our world would be different if we didn't have nouns or verbs in the language that we spoke. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis really says that our views of reality certainly differ by culture. In terms of cultural differences, I want you to think about a continuum. Because our world is full of co- and subcultures, many times people exhibit different characteristics even if they're from the same country, city, or town. The most well-known differences are that of individualism versus collectivism and high versus low context. Let's talk about individualism versus collectivism first. In an individualistic culture, members teach each other the importance of individual values. So, a more individualistic culture would value things like power, achievement, hedonism, or pleasure-seeking, and also take pride in standing out. On the other side of the continuum, a collectivist culture teaches members the importance of group values rather than individual. A collectivistic culture values things like benevolence, tradition, conformity, and they take pride in similarity. When we discuss the difference between high and low context cultures, it is important to first define context. Context is the physical, psychological, social, and temporal environment in which communication takes place. So with a high context culture, much of the information in communication is within the context or the person. A high context culture, they shape their communication based on previous communication practices. They have certain assumptions about how communication should take place, and this is largely based on shared experiences. We'll talk a lot about the idea of face in this course, but for now, a high context culture, they really value face saving, or saving others from embarrassment. And also in a high context culture, things like criticism only take place in a private place. Conversely, with a low context culture, much of the information in communication is explicitly stated in verbal messages. A low context culture is more likely to use direct communication, and also is more likely to use argumentation to prove a point. There are several other cultural differences described in your text. First is the difference between a universalist and an exclusionist culture. In a universalist culture, people are treated as individuals rather than groups. Often, this is highly correlated with individualism. On the other side, an exclusionist culture is highly correlated with collectivism, and they foster in-group affiliation with much less respect for those who aren't in the group. Power distance, or the distribution of power in society, can also vary by culture. Here in the United States, in the classroom, there's a lower power distance between me as the instructor and you as the student, as opposed to some Asian countries where there is a much greater power difference. There's also masculine or feminine differences in culture. This is not to perpetuate stereotypes, but rather it's more of a descriptive term. In a masculine culture, you value material success, whereas a feminine culture, things like modesty and concern for relationships are more highly valued. Also, a tolerance for ambiguity can be a big difference in some cultures. So, do you worry about what will happen next? Similarly, our orientation can be a big difference as well. So, a long-term orientation means that we think about the future, whereas a short-term orientation, we value the past and the present a bit more. And finally, indulgence or restraint. A more indulgent culture emphasizes the gratification of desires. They focus on having fun and enjoying life. Where a more restrained culture, the gratification is restricted by some underlying social norms. In order to increase our intercultural communication competence, there are a few steps that we can take. First, educate yourself. For example, any business-savvy person should certainly research Japanese culture before meeting an important Japanese client in Tokyo. Showing knowledge and respect for other cultures can go a long way. Second, we should recognize similarities and differences. I often cringe when I hear people say that they don't see differences between groups, usually referring to skin color, and remember that's not indicative of any certain culture, but it's still simply not true. We will learn more about perception in Chapter 3. Third, confronting your own stereotypes is critical. Much of our ability to learn and relate to others is hampered by our own categorizations or generalizations. Fourth, we should try to reduce our own ethnocentrism, or the idea that our culture is superior to that of other people. Finally, adjusting our communication. For example, bowing to greet others in some Asian countries is more polite than the traditional North American handshake. The cultural orientation assignment is designed to help develop an awareness of your own culture and how this may impact your communication behaviors. I look forward to reading your responses. I'll see y'all next time.